Now, here's a big question for you. Is capitalism the best system for delivering prosperity for us all? Some of us might have our doubts, giving stuff like, rising inequalities, the financial crash and austerity, but Dr. Rainer Zitelmann says it is. He's billed as one of the world's leading economic historians, and he says people who live in countries that give capitalism freer rein and reduce the influence of the state to the economy always do better than those living under socialist systems. We spoke to Dr. Zitelmann earlier, and he explained why.
I see capitalism as a system whose merits many people today do not recognize. I remember when the wall came down here in Berlin and when socialism broke 30 years ago, we all saw that capitalism is the better alternative as socialism. But today, I think many people forget about this. For example, in Berlin, the city where I live, we're currently having a discussion about referendum on the expropriation of private housing companies. Or the German energy industry has been transformed more and more into a planned economy in recent years. And if I look to the discussion in UK and especially the demands of Jeremy Corbyn, I think sometimes that many British have forgotten one thing. Everything that Corbyn demands today has happened before in the 70s. With high taxes, many state-owned enterprises, strong regulation on the economy, and you know the result. What happened in the 70s when UK was called the sick man of Europe, and I wonder whether we want to go back to this time.
But capitalism is not exactly going through a good patch at the moment. I know there are some tremendously rich people, but we had a downturn, a currency crash effectively 10 years ago, a financial crisis. And things have flatlined in most countries since then, most capitalist countries, haven't they?
In my book, The Power of Capitalism, this is the book where I'm talking about, I have one chapter, it's only about the causes of the financial crisis. And I think that this is an absolute false interpretation, that this was the fault of capitalism. On the contrary, this financial crisis was due to lower interest rates from the central banks, what has nothing to do with capitalism. And on the other hand, we had in the United States a lot of regulations by the state that forced banks to give the so-called subprime loans. So this had nothing to do with capitalism. And if the diagnosis is wrong, I think then the therapy is wrong.
Isn't the danger with capitalism, though, the risk? Capitalism comes with a risk that rich people, if they're earning their money and maybe their taxes are lowered, the idea being that they spend more on their luxury mansions or they build stuff or lavish holiday, and the people who are associated with those industries benefit. But if the rich save more of their disposable income, growth slows down. So how does capitalism benefit across communities?
I have a worldwide view in my book, and in the last decades, so many hundreds of millions of people came out of extremely poverty, and this was because people trusted in a lot of countries more in private property and in market economy than in planned economy. I give the example of China, for example. 30 years ago, 88% of people in China lived in poverty. And sure, we have now a lot of billionaires and rich people in China on the one hand, but on the other hand, I have been in China and I asked the people there whether they like to go back 30 years ago. I think a lot of people don't know it. In this time of socialism, 45 million people died in the end of the 50s in China. And today we have such a great development. And this was because people trusted more in private property and more in free market economy than in planned economy. And on the other hand, you have this last socialism experiment in Venezuela. I read a lot of quotes from Jeremy Corbyn some years ago, he was absolutely enthusiastic about Hugo Chavez and his socialist experiment in Venezuela, and as well here, people in the United States, the leftists, and in Germany, they were so enthusiastic about Venezuela as a role model, even for other economies. And what happened? It happened the same thing that we had in the last 100 years, that this socialist experiment failed. And so I think capitalism is not only good for rich people, but it's much, much more important for the poor people everywhere in the world.
That was Dr. Rainer Zitelmann. His rosy view of capitalism may be coloured by the fact, as he told us once before, I am rich. But he does have 2 doctorates in economics.